Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Putnam sat in a room and imagined two planets, identical in every way, except one, Earth and twin Earth, perfect mirrors of each other, down to the last atom, the last thought, the last whispered word. And on Earth there is water, H2O, the molecule that makes up oceans and rivers and rain. And on twin Earth there is also water, but it is not H2O. It is XYZ, a completely different substance with different chemical structure, different molecular bonds, different properties at the microscopic level. Yet to everyone living on twin Earth it looks exactly like water, tastes exactly like water, behaves exactly like water. It fills their lakes and falls from their clouds and quenches their thirst just as water does on Earth. Now imagine two people, one on Earth and one on twin Earth. Call them both Oscar. And these two Oscars are molecule for molecule identical. Same brain structure, same neural patterns, same memories, same thoughts, same internal psychological states. Everything inside their heads is exactly the same. And both Oscars look at a glass of liquid and say the word water. They both think they are referring to the same thing. They both believe they know what water is, but Putnam asks a simple question that shatters centuries of philosophy. Are they actually referring to the same thing? And the answer is no. Earth Oscar's word water refers to H2O. Twin Earth Oscar's word water refers to XYZ. Same word, same internal mental state, but different meanings, different references, different extensions in the world. And this means that meaning is not determined by what is in the head. Meaning is not a function of internal psychological states. Meaning is not private, not subjective, not locked inside the skull waiting to be discovered through introspection. The tradition, before Putnam, stretching back through Locke and Hume and Descartes, believed that meanings were mental entities, that words were connected to ideas in the mind, that reference was mediated by internal representations, by concepts, by mental images, and if you wanted to know what someone meant by a word, you had to look inside their head, examine their thoughts, map their mental contents, and this made sense, it felt right. It aligned with the intuition that language is personal, that each person has their own private understanding of words, their own associations, their own mental dictionary. But Putnam showed that this entire picture was wrong, that two people could have identical mental contents and still mean different things by the same word. That meaning reaches beyond the skull, beyond the brain, beyond psychology entirely, into the world itself, into the environment, into the physical and social context that determines what words actually refer to. This is semantic externalism, the view that meanings are not in the head but out in the world. That reference is determined not by internal states but by external relations, by causal connections between words and things, by the history of how a word came to be used, by the community of speakers who share the word, by the natural kinds that exist independently of human thought. And this means that you can be wrong about what you mean. You can use a word your entire life and not know what it really refers to. You can have perfect confidence in your understanding and still be completely mistaken, because meaning is not something you possess. It is something you participate in, something that exists in the space between speakers and world, between language and reality, between words and the things they pick out. Putnam's argument did not stop at twin earth. He pushed further. He talked about the division of linguistic labour, the fact that most people do not know the technical details of what their words refer to. Most people cannot define gold in terms of atomic number, cannot distinguish an elm from a beech, cannot explain what makes aluminum different from molybdenum. Yet they use these words successfully. They refer to these things accurately, and they do so not because they have the right mental contents, but because they are embedded in a community where some people do have the expertise, where metallurgists know about aluminum, where botanists know about elms, where chemists know about gold. And when ordinary speakers use these words, they defer to the experts. They rely on the division of labour. They trust that somewhere in the linguistic community, there are people who know what these words really mean, who can distinguish the real thing from the fake. And this trust is what allows language to function, what allows reference to succeed even in the absence of individual knowledge. This overturns the Cartesian picture entirely. Descartes believed that knowledge began with the self, with the contents of consciousness, with what could be known through introspection, and from there one built outward to knowledge of the world. But Putnam showed that the order is reversed, that knowledge of meaning requires knowledge of the world first, that you cannot know what you mean without knowing what your words refer to, and you cannot know what your words refer to just by looking inside your own mind. You have to look outside to the physical environment, to the social context, to the history of usage, to the experts who maintain the standards of reference. And this means that the self is not the foundation of knowledge, but a participant in a larger system, a node in a network of linguistic and social relations that determine meaning collectively, not individually, externally, not internally. Frege tried to solve the problem of meaning differently. He distinguished between sense and reference, between the mode of presentation and the thing presented, and he believed that sense was in the mind, that it mediated reference, that two people could refer to the same thing through different senses, like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to Venus, and this preserved the idea that meaning had a mental component, that internal states mattered. But Putnam's argument cut through this because on twin earth, Oscar and his counterpart have the same sense, the same mode of presentation, the same mental mediation, but they do not have the same reference. They are not talking about the same substance. And this means that sense alone does not determine reference, that no amount of mental content can fix what a word picks out in the world, that reference requires something beyond sense, beyond psychology, beyond anything that can be captured by introspection or phenomenology. Kripke reinforced this from another angle. He argued that names and natural kind terms were rigid designators, that they referred to the same thing in all possible worlds, not by virtue of satisfying a description, but by virtue of causal historical chains, that the word water refers to H2O because it was introduced to refer to a certain substance, and that reference was passed down through generations of speakers, through baptism and transmission, through ostension and use. And even if speakers lost track of what the substance was, even if they forgot its chemical composition, even if they developed false beliefs about it, the words still referred to the same thing, because reference is not determined by beliefs but by the causal connection between word and world, by the chain that links current usage back to the original act of naming, back to the moment when the word was first attached to the thing. This has radical implications for psychology, because it means psychology cannot determine reference, cannot tell you what your words mean, cannot give you the extension of your terms just by examining your mental states. And this was a blow to cognitive science, to theories of mind that tried to explain language purely in terms of internal representations, in terms of concepts and mental models and computational processes, because Putnam and Kripke showed that none of this is enough. That meaning leaks out of the head, that it requires the world, requires the community, requires the causal historical context. And without these external factors, there is no meaning at all. Just empty sounds, just syntax without semantics, just symbols shuffling around inside the skull with no connection to reality. Yet people resist this conclusion. They cling to the intuition that they know what they mean, that their words are transparent to them. That meaning is something they possess and control. And this resistance is understandable because semantic externalism is deeply unsettling. It suggests that we are strangers to our own language, that we do not fully understand the words we speak, that meaning is not something we create, but something we inherit, something we are thrown into, something that precedes us and exceeds us and determines what we can say before we even open our mouths. Wittgenstein saw this too, though from a different direction. He argued that meaning is use, that words get their meaning from the language games they are embedded in, from the forms of life that give them context. And he rejected the idea of private language, the idea that meaning could be purely internal, purely subjective, because a private language would have no standards of correctness, no way to distinguish between following a rule and merely thinking one is following a rule. And without standards, there is no meaning, just the illusion of meaning, just the feeling of understanding without actual understanding. And this is why language must be public, why it must be shared, why it requires a community of speakers who can correct each other, who can point out mistakes, who can maintain the norms that make reference possible. Putnam took this further. He showed not just that language is public, but that meaning is not even fully determined by the community, that it reaches beyond the community into the world itself, that natural kind terms like water and gold and tiger refer to whatever has the same underlying nature as the paradigm samples, the same deep structure, the same essential properties, and this means that meaning can outrun knowledge, that a community can use a word correctly even when they have false beliefs about what they are referring to, even when their theories are wrong, even when their understanding is incomplete, because the word latches onto the real essence, the objective structure, the natural kind that exists independently of human thought. And the world itself constrains meaning, corrects mistakes, determines reference in ways that no internal psychological state can capture. This is why Aristotle was not wrong when he talked about water, even though he did not know about molecules, even though his theory of elements was false. He was still referring to H2O because his word water was causally connected to the same substance our word water refers to, because the reference was fixed not by his beliefs, but by the stuff itself, by the samples he pointed to, by the liquid he drank and swam in and observed, and the continuity of reference across theory change, across conceptual revolutions, across the abandonment of entire frameworks, shows that meaning is anchored in the world, not in the mind, that it survives the death of theories because it was never dependent on theories in the first place. But this raises a puzzle. If meaning is not in the head, if psychological states do not determine reference, then what role does the mind play at all? What is psychology supposed to study if not meaning, if not the contents of thought, if not the representations that mediate between language and world? And Putnam's answer is that psychology studies something real. It studies mental states. It studies computational processes. It studies the functional organization of cognition, but it does not study meaning, because meaning is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a semantic phenomenon. It is a relation between words and world, between signs and reference, between language and reality, and this relation is not mediated by anything in the head. It is direct. It is external. It is constituted by causal and social factors that lie beyond the reach of introspection, beyond the scope of neuroscience, beyond the explanatory power of any psychological theory. Fodor resisted this. He wanted to preserve a role for internal content, for narrow content, for something in the head that could do explanatory work, and he argued that even if meaning is wide, even if reference is external, there must be something narrow that explains behaviour, some internal state that mediates between input and output, some mental representation that the cognitive system manipulates. And he tried to carve out a space for psychology by distinguishing between wide content, which depends on the environment, and narrow content, which does not, which is purely internal, purely psychological, purely computational. But this move was always unstable because narrow content turned out to be elusive, hard to define, hard to individuate, hard to see how it could play the explanatory role Fodor wanted it to play. And many philosophers concluded that narrow content was a myth, that there was no such thing, that all content was wide, that meaning was always externalist, always dependent on factors beyond the head, and if psychology wanted to explain behaviour, it would have to appeal to wide content, to states that are individuated by their relations to the environment, to representations that are only representations in virtue of their connections to what they represent. This is deeply counterintuitive, because it means that two people in identical internal states could be thinking different thoughts, could be believing different things, could be referring to different objects, just because they are in different environments, just because their words have different causal histories, just because the world around them is structured differently. And this seems to violate the intuition that mental states are internal, that what you're thinking is determined by what is going on inside your head, that consciousness is private, that the contents of experience are immediately accessible to introspection. But Putnam and Kripke showed that this intuition is wrong, that mental states are not self-intimating, that you can be mistaken about what you're thinking, that the meanings of your thoughts depend on facts about the world that you may not know, that reference is opaque, that you can use words successfully without understanding what they mean, that language works not because speakers have perfect knowledge, but because they are embedded in networks of reference that do the work for them, that connect words to things through mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness, below the level of intentional control. Burge extended this argument to mental content itself. He argued that not just linguistic meaning, but thought itself is individuated externally, that beliefs and desires are identified by their relations to the environment, that you could not have a belief about water if you lived in a world with no water, that mental content is essentially relational, essentially dependent on what exists outside the mind, and this means that the mind is not a self-contained system, not a module that could be studied in isolation, not a computational device that processes inputs according to internal rules, but an open system, a system that is constituted by its interactions with the world, that is shaped by its environment, that cannot be understood without reference to the physical and social context it is embedded in. This has implications for artificial intelligence, for the question of whether machines can think, because if meaning is external, if reference depends on causal historical connections, if mental content is individuated by relations to the environment, then a computer program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot have genuine thoughts unless it has the right connections to the world, unless it is embedded in the right kind of causal network, unless it participates in the same linguistic and social practices that give human words their meanings. And this suggests that thought is not just computation, not just symbol manipulation, not just syntactic operations on formal structures, but something that requires embodiment, requires situatedness, requires participation in a form of life, and a brain in a vat, no matter how complex its internal processes, would not be thinking about water or trees or anything else, because its words would not be connected to anything, would not refer to anything, would be empty symbols with no semantic content, no meaning, no reference, just syntax running in a void. Putnam himself later came to doubt some of his own arguments. He worried that semantic externalism led to metaphysical realism, to the view that there is a fixed, determinate way the world is, independent of human conceptual schemes, independent of language, independent of theory, and he came to think this was incoherent, that it made reference magical, that it required a God's eye view, a perspective from nowhere that could compare words to things without being situated in any particular framework, and he moved toward internal realism, toward the view that truth and reference are always relative to a conceptual scheme, always dependent on the practices and norms of a community, always constrained by what Quine called the tribunal of experience, but never fully determined by it. And this introduced a tension, a pull between the external world that constrains reference and the internal practices that constitute meaning, a tension that Putnam never fully resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, because meaning lives in that tension, in the space between mind and world, between language and reality, between what we intend and what our words actually pick out. Dennett approached this from yet another angle. He argued that meaning is not a real property but a useful fiction, that intentional states are not natural kinds but interpretive stances, that when we attribute beliefs and desires, we are not discovering facts about the mind but adopting a strategy for predicting behaviour. And from this perspective, the question of whether meaning is in the head or in the world dissolves. Because meaning is not anywhere, it is not a real thing but a pattern we impose, a way of organising our understanding of complex systems. And the intentional stance works whether we apply it to humans or thermostats or chess programs. The difference is just pragmatic, just a matter of what level of description is most useful for prediction and explanation. Not a matter of what really has meaning and what does not, because nothing really has meaning. Meaning is always an interpretation, always a projection, always a way of seeing that could be otherwise. But this seems too deflationary, too quick to dismiss the felt reality of meaning, the undeniable sense that words do connect to things, that thoughts are about the world. That reference is not just a useful fiction but a real relation, and even if we cannot fully explain how this relation works, even if semantic externalism leaves gaps and puzzles, it at least takes seriously the intuition that language matters, that what we say makes a difference, that truth is not just coherence within a system but correspondence with reality, however elusive and problematic that correspondence may be. And to give up on this, to reduce meaning to a mere interpretive stance, feels like giving up on something essential, something worth preserving even if we cannot fully explain it, even if it leads to paradoxes and tensions that resist resolution. Because the alternative is a world where nothing means anything, where language floats free of reality, where thought is cut loose from the world, and that is a world too empty, too barren, too divorced from lived experience to be acceptable, even if it is theoretically cleaner, even if it avoids the hard problems, even if it makes philosophy easier by making meaning disappear. Power does not distribute evenly, does not spread across populations in equal measure, does not settle into equilibrium where everyone has the same, but instead concentrates, accumulates, forms gradients that are steep, that create hierarchies that are natural, not in the sense of being just, but in the sense of being inevitable, being the default pattern that emerges whenever humans organise, whenever groups form, whenever coordination is needed. And the need for coordination is constant, is the condition of social existence, and coordination requires decision-making, requires that someone decides when decisions cannot be made collectively, when consensus is impossible, when speed is necessary, and the necessity creates the opening for power, creates the opportunity for some to decide for others, and the deciding is power, is the core of it, is the ability to shape outcomes, to determine directions, to control resources, and once this ability concentrates, once some have it more than others, the concentration tends to increase, tends to amplify, tends to create the hierarchies that are visible in every society, every organisation, Every group that persists over time because power reproduces power is self-reinforcing, is creating the conditions that allow more power to accumulate, and the accumulation is not accidental, is not the result of conspiracy, is the natural geometry of social organization, is the shape that power takes when humans interact over time, and the shape is pyramidal, is hierarchical, is arranging people into levels, into ranks, into positions that vary in their access to resources, to decision-making, to influence, and the variation is not small, is not modest, is extreme, is exponential, is creating gaps between levels that are wider than the gaps within levels. And the widest gap is at the top, is between those who have power and those who do not. And those who have power are few, are the minority, are the elite who sit at the apex of the hierarchy. And the apex is narrow, is limited, is only accommodating a small number, because power shared is power diluted, is power threatened, is power that might be challenged, and so those at the top work to maintain their position, work to prevent others from ascending, work to ensure that the hierarchy remains steep, remains stable, remains resistant to change, and the resistance is not passive, is active, is the exercise of power to preserve power, is the use of resources to maintain access to resources, is the employment of influence to prevent the emergence of rival influences, and the employment is continuous, is strategic, is operating at multiple levels, through multiple mechanisms, through the formal and the informal, through the visible and the invisible, through the structures that are explicit and the processes that are hidden, and the hidden is where power is most effective, is where it operates without being seen, without being named, without being recognized as power. Because power that is visible is power that can be challenged, that can be resisted, that can be opposed, but power that is invisible, that operates through assumptions, through norms, through the structures that are taken for granted, is power that is unassailable, is power that reproduces itself without anyone noticing, without anyone objecting, without anyone having the language to describe what is happening. And what is happening is the maintenance of hierarchy through the 1,000 small mechanisms that ensure power stays where it is, that prevent redistribution, that make equality impossible, not just difficult, but structurally impossible, because the system is designed to concentrate power, is organized to funnel resources upward, is arranged to ensure that those at the top remain at the top, and the remaining is not guaranteed by force alone, is not maintained through violence alone, though violence is always available, is always in the background, is the ultimate guarantee of hierarchy. But most of the time force is not needed, is not employed because power has more subtle tools, has mechanisms that operate through consent, through the willing participation of those who are dominated. And the willing is not coerced in the obvious sense, is not forced at gunpoint, is produced through ideology, through the stories that are told about why hierarchy is natural, is necessary, is beneficial. And the beneficial is what those at the top claim, is what they teach, is what they convince others to believe, that hierarchy serves everyone, that power at the top creates order that protects those below, that inequality is the price of stability, of prosperity, of progress, and progress is the mythology that justifies hierarchy, that makes inequality seem temporary, that makes power seem earned, that makes the concentration seem like the result of merit rather than of position. And position is what matters, is what determines outcomes, is what makes some people powerful and others powerless. But the position is inherited, is transmitted, is maintained across generations through the mechanisms that convert power into wealth and wealth into power. And the conversion is seamless, is automatic, is the way that hierarchy perpetuates itself, that ensures that the children of the powerful are powerful, that the descendants of the elite remain elite, that the system reproduces itself. And the reproduction is not perfect, is not total. There is some mobility, some movement between levels, some stories of ascent that serve to legitimate the system, that create the illusion of meritocracy, that make it seem as though anyone can rise, but the rising is rare, is exceptional, is the exception that proves the rule. And the rule is that power stays where it is, that hierarchy is stable, that the geometry is fixed, and the fixing is not natural in the sense of being inevitable by physics, but is natural in the sense of emerging from the logic of organization, from the mathematics of networks, from the dynamics of accumulation, because power is not zero-sum in the short term, can grow, can expand, can create more power, but in the long term, in the context of limited resources, of finite opportunities, of scarce positions, power is rivalrous, is competed for, is gained by some at the expense of others. And the gaining is easier for those who already have power, is easier from positions of advantage, is following the principle that Matthew identified, that to those who have more will be given, and from those who have little, even what they have will be taken, and the taking is not theft, is not crime, is the normal operation of systems that concentrate power, that funnel resources upward, that ensure that advantage compounds, that success breeds success, that power accumulates and the accumulation is exponential, is accelerating, is creating gaps that widen over time, that make the top more distant from the bottom, that make mobility less possible, that make hierarchy more rigid, more entrenched, more resistant to change. And the resistance is structural, is built into the geometry, is not requiring conspiracy, not requiring explicit coordination, is just the natural result of power protecting itself, of those at the top using their position to maintain their position, and the maintenance is not cynical, is not experienced as exploitation, is justified through ideologies that explain why hierarchy is good, why power deserves to be concentrated, why inequality is natural, and natural is the word that does the work, is the justification, is the claim that hierarchy is not created by humans, but is discovered in nature, is visible in animals, in the dominance hierarchies that primates form, that wolves form, that even chickens form, and the forming is instinctive, is biological, is the way that evolution has shaped social species. And if it is natural, then it is not unjust, is not wrong, is simply the way things are, and the way things are is the most powerful justification, is the argument that requires no argument, is the appeal to inevitability, to necessity, to the claim that hierarchy cannot be otherwise. And the cannot is false, is ideological, is the masking of choice as fate, is the presentation of arrangement as nature. Because hierarchies are arrangements, are geometries that are created, that are maintained, that are enforced, and the enforcement is continuous, is requiring effort, is revealing that the naturalness is myth, is story, is the cover for power, for the exercise of domination, for the structuring of society in ways that benefit the top at the expense of the bottom. And the bottom is where most people are, is the base of the pyramid, is the many who support the few, who generate the resources that are concentrated at the apex, who do the work that creates the wealth that flows upward. And the flowing is not natural, but is designed, is structured through laws, through institutions, through the mechanisms that extract value from the many and deliver it to the few. And the delivery is called profit, is called return, is called the reward for capital, for ownership, for the position of controlling resources. And control is power, is the core of it, is the ability to decide how resources are used, who benefits, who is excluded, and the exclusion is the mechanism, is how hierarchy maintains itself, is how power reproduces power, because access is limited, is restricted, is controlled by those who already have access. And access to what? To opportunities, to resources, to the positions that confer power. And the conferring is not automatic, is not open, is requiring credentials, requiring connections, requiring the social capital that comes from position. And position is inherited, is transmitted, is the thing that makes hierarchy stable, that prevents mobility, that ensures that the geometry remains fixed. And the fixed is what those at the top want, is what they work to maintain, is what they defend through the mechanisms that are both overt and covert, that operate through law and through culture, through institutions and through norms, through the structures that are formal and the processes that are informal. And the informal is where much of the work happens, is where power operates most effectively, through networks, through relationships, through the soft power that is harder to see, harder to challenge, harder to dismantle than the hard power of force, of law, of explicit command, because soft power operates through influence, through persuasion, through the shaping of desires and beliefs, through the creation of consent. And consent is what makes hierarchy stable, is what allows domination without constant coercion, is what Gramsci called hegemony, is the condition where the dominated accept their domination, where the powerless believe in the legitimacy of power, where the hierarchy seems natural, seems right, seems like the way things should be, and the should is the achievement, is the conversion of power into authority, of domination into legitimacy, of hierarchy into order. And order is what power promises, is what it delivers, is the stability that comes from everyone knowing their place, accepting their rank, performing their role. And the performing is not resisted, because resistance seems pointless, seems impossible, seems like challenging nature itself. And nature is the mask, is the story, is the ideology that makes power invisible, that makes hierarchy seem inevitable, that makes inequality seem like the necessary cost of civilization. And civilization is the achievement of hierarchy, is the organization of humans into structures that are complex, that are specialized, that are requiring coordination. And coordination is impossible without power, without hierarchy, without someone deciding, someone directing, someone controlling. And the controlling is concentrated, is centralized, is accumulating at the top. And the top is where decisions are made, where resources are allocated, where the direction is set. And the setting is not democratic, is not collective, is not reflecting the will of the many, but is reflecting the interests of the few, of those who have power, of those who sit at the apex. And the apex is maintained through the geometry, through the structure that ensures power flows upward, that resources concentrate, that advantage compounds. And the compounding is what makes hierarchy self-perpetuating, is what makes power stable, is what prevents the redistribution that would create equality. And equality is unstable, is impossible to maintain, is the condition that immediately begins to dissolve once it is achieved. Because humans are not equal in ability, in effort, in ambition. And these differences, even small differences, compound over time, create advantages, create positions, create the beginnings of hierarchy. And once hierarchy begins, it accelerates, it amplifies, it creates the geometry that is inevitable. That is natural, not because it is good, but because it is the pattern that emerges from the mathematics of accumulation, from the logic of networks, from the dynamics of power. And power, seeks to grow, seeks to concentrate. And the concentration is resisted, is challenged, is fought against by those who are excluded, by those who are dominated, by those who suffer under hierarchy. But the resistance is difficult, is requiring coordination, is requiring resources, is requiring power. And power is what the powerless lack, is what they're excluded from, is what makes resistance so difficult, so costly, so often unsuccessful. And the unsuccessful is what history shows, is what the record demonstrates, is the pattern of hierarchies rising and falling, but never disappearing, never being replaced by equality, only being replaced by new hierarchies, by new elites, by new concentrations of power that reproduce the geometry, that maintain the structure, that ensure that power remains concentrated, that hierarchy remains the default, remains the pattern, remains the inevitable outcome of human organization. And the organization is what creates power, is what makes hierarchy necessary, or seems to make it necessary. Because organization requires coordination, and coordination requires decision-making, and decision-making requires power. And power is what? Some have and others do not. And those who have it work to keep it, work to grow it, work to pass it on. And the passing on is inheritance, is the mechanism of reproduction, is what makes hierarchy stable across time. And the stability is what those at the top value, is what they work to maintain, is what they defend against challenges, against redistribution, against the equality that would threaten their position. And the position is everything, is what determines outcomes, is what makes life easy or hard, is what provides access or denies it, is what confers power or withholds it. And the withholding is structural, is built into the geometry, is the way that hierarchy maintains itself, is the iron law that Michael's identified, is the principle that all organizations, even those founded on egalitarian principles, eventually develop hierarchies, eventually concentrate power, eventually create oligarchies, because organization requires leadership, and leadership becomes power, and power becomes self-perpetuating, becomes the thing that shapes the organization to serve the leaders rather than the members. And the members are the many, are the base, are those who do the work but do not make the decisions, do not control the resources, do not have the power, and the power is what accumulates at the top, is what defines the apex, is what makes hierarchy hierarchical, and the hierarchical is the geometry, is the structure, is the arrangement that is not accidental, is not temporary, is not the result of bad actors or flawed systems, but is the natural pattern, the inevitable outcome, the shape that power takes when humans organize, when groups form, when societies persist. And the persistence is what makes hierarchy visible, is what reveals the geometry, is what shows that power does not distribute evenly, does not create equality, does not settle into balance, but instead concentrates, accumulates, forms the pyramids that are visible everywhere, in every society, in every organization, in every context where humans coordinate. And the coordination requires hierarchy, or seems to require it, and the seeming is enough, is what makes it real, is what makes the geometry inevitable, is what ensures that power will concentrate, that inequality will persist, that hierarchy will remain the default pattern, the natural arrangement, the geometry of power that shapes human life, that determines outcomes, that creates the world where some have much and most have little, where some decide and most obey, where some rule and most are ruled, and the ruling is not eternal, is not permanent. Hierarchies fall, are replaced, are overturned, but they are not eliminated, are not abolished, are not transcended, because the geometry remains, the pattern persists, the structure reasserts itself, and new hierarchies form, new elites emerge, new concentrations of power accumulate at new apexes, and the cycle continues. The pattern repeats, the geometry remains. Because power concentrates, because hierarchy is natural, because equality is unstable, because the geometry of power is not optional, is not chosen, is not the result of conspiracy or design, but is the inevitable outcome, the natural pattern, the way that power arranges itself when humans organize, and the organizing never stops, and the hierarchy never ends, and the geometry persists, always, inevitably, naturally, as the shape of power, as the structure of domination, as the pattern that defines human society, that creates inequality, that maintains hierarchy, that ensures that power remains concentrated, that the few rule the many, that the apex dominates the base, that the geometry of power remains fixed, remains stable, remains the eternal pattern, the natural arrangement, the inevitable structure that is hierarchy, that is power, That is the way things are and have always been and will always be, as long as humans organise, as long as groups form, as long as power exists, and power always exists, always concentrates, always creates the geometry that is hierarchy, that is domination, that is the natural, inevitable, inescapable pattern of human organisation. And the organisation is power, and power is hierarchy, and hierarchy is geometry, and the geometry is eternal. Time feels like a river flowing in one direction, from past through present toward future, and this feeling is so fundamental to human experience that questioning it seems absurd, seems like denying gravity or claiming water flows upward. But the feeling of time's flow is not a direct perception of reality, but a construction, a story. The brain tells about the relationship between events, and when physicists examine the universe at its most fundamental level, they find no flow, no arrow, no distinction between past and future written into the equations, find only a four-dimensional block where all moments exist simultaneously, where what humans call past and what they call future are just directions in space-time, no different than up and down. And this creates a profound puzzle, a gap between how time appears in experience and how it exists in reality, between the subjective sense of moving through time and the objective structure that contains no movement, only arrangement, only the geometry of causation. And this gap suggests that the experience of time is not a feature of the universe, but a feature of consciousness. Not something discovered, but something manufactured. And understanding how this manufacturing happens, how the brain constructs the illusion of flow from raw sensory data and memory and anticipation, reveals something strange about what humans are, about how awareness works, about the mechanisms that create the sense of being a continuous self moving through a series of moments, rather than what might actually be the case, which is that there is no continuous self, and there are no discrete moments, but only patterns of neural activity that interpret themselves as experiencing time, when really they are just responding to change, just processing difference, just comparing present states with stored representations of past states, and calling that comparison memory, calling that experience history, calling that sensation the passage of time. But the passage is metaphor, is language, trying to capture something that has no literal motion, no actual flow, because nothing is passing, nothing is moving. There is only the fact of change, the fact that one configuration of matter gives way to another configuration, and the brain, being a system that persists across configurations, that maintains some continuity of structure, even as its content shifts, interprets this persistence as duration, as a self that endures, as an identity that travels from then to now. But the travelling is illusion. The self at each moment is different from the self at every other moment, shares some patterns, some connections, some information, but is not the same thing, is not a substance that moves, but a process that recurs. And what is called the experience of time is really the experience of this process recognizing its own recurrence, noticing that the current pattern resembles previous patterns, that there is continuity even though there is no identity, that memory creates the appearance of a past that the present self once inhabited, when really the past exists only as traces, as modifications to neural structure, as information encoded in synaptic weights. And these traces are not recordings, are not faithful representations, are reconstructions, are guesses about what must have happened based on fragmentary evidence. And every time a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed slightly differently, is altered by the present context, by current beliefs, by subsequent experiences, and so the past is not fixed, is not a stable foundation upon which the present stands, but is constantly being rewritten, constantly being adjusted to fit the story. The brain is telling about who it is and how it got here, and this means that personal history is fiction, not in the sense of being deliberately false, but in the sense of being narrative, being shaped by the requirements of coherence and meaning rather than by pure correspondence to what actually occurred. And what actually occurred is anyway inaccessible, is gone. It exists only in the present, in the form of these unreliable traces that claim to point backward, but really only point to themselves, only demonstrate that something happened without being able to show exactly what. And the brain fills in the gaps, invents details, smooths over inconsistencies, creates a past that makes sense of the present, even if that past never happened quite the way it is remembered. And people are completely unaware of this invention, completely convinced that memory is retrieval, that remembering is like playing back a recording, when really it is more like improvising a story based on a few key words, more like confabulation than documentation, and the implications are vertiginous because if the past is unreliable, then what is the present based on? What is the foundation of identity? If history is malleable, what does it mean to be the same person over time if the time itself is constructed and the person at each moment is different and the memories connecting them are fabricated? And perhaps the answer is that there is no foundation, no solid ground, no identity in the sense of something that persists unchanged. Only the process of identification, the act of claiming continuity, the narrative that says, I am the one who did that, who experienced this, who will do something else tomorrow, and this narrative is not true or false but functional, is a tool the brain uses to coordinate behavior across time, to plan, to learn, to maintain social relationships. Because others expect continuity, expect that the person they met yesterday will be recognizably the same person today. And so the brain provides that continuity, constructs that sameness, even though at the level of neurons and molecules, there is constant flux, constant replacement, constant change. Henri Bergson argued that there are two kinds of time, clock time and lived time, the abstract mathematical time of physics that divides duration into discrete instants, measurable and uniform, and the qualitative time of consciousness that cannot be divided, that is not made of moments, but is a continuous flow, an indivisible duration where past and present interpenetrate, where memory is not storage but preservation, where the whole of experience is always present, always accessible, not as separate events but as a cumulative whole. And Bergson called this duration, and he believed that science, by spatializing time, by treating it as if it were a line made of points, misses what time actually is in lived experience, misses the flow, the thickness, the way that consciousness is always multiple, always containing more than the present instant, always reaching backward into memory and forward into anticipation. And this multiplicity is what gives experience its richness. Its texture is what makes a melody more than a sequence of individual notes. Because the melody is heard as a whole, as a pattern that emerges from the relationship between notes rather than from the notes themselves. And this pattern exists only in duration, only in the continuous present that holds the past notes in memory while the current note is sounding. And without this duration, there would be no music, no meaning, no connection between moments, just isolated sensations with no relationship. And Bergson believed that the brain does not produce consciousness but limits it, filters it, reduces the totality of duration to the narrow slice that is relevant for action, for survival, for navigating the practical demands of living in a body. And what is called the present moment is really just this filtered slice, this pragmatic selection from the fullness of time and different states of consciousness. Different drugs, different practices can alter the filter, can expand the present, can make it thicker or thinner, can change how much of the past is felt to be co-present with the now. And this variability shows that the present is not a fixed instant, but a flexible window, a span that can be adjusted, and what determines the adjustment is not the external world, but the internal state. The brain's current configuration, its chemical balance, its attentional focus. And so the experience of time is not a passive registration of external temporal facts, but an active construction that varies with the observer, that is different for different species, different for different individuals, different even for the same individual in different circumstances. And this relativity of subjective time is separate from the relativity of physics, is about consciousness rather than space-time, is about how duration is experienced rather than how it is measured. And Bergson thought that science could never capture this experiential dimension, could never reduce durée to equations, because equations deal with space, and time deals with change, with becoming, with something that is not spatial and cannot be spatialized without losing its essential character. And whether Bergson was right about this is debatable. Neuroscience has made significant progress in understanding how the brain constructs temporal experience, has identified mechanisms involved in time perception, in the binding of events into sequences, in the calibration of subjective duration. But whether this understanding captures what Bergson meant by durée, whether it explains the qualitative feel of time passing, is less clear, is perhaps another instance of the explanatory gap, the hard problem of consciousness applied to temporality. The question of why there is something it is like to experience duration, rather than time just being a parameter in neural computations without any felt quality, without any phenomenology. The specious present, a term coined by William James, refers to the fact that what is experienced as now is not an instantaneous point, but a short interval, usually estimated at around 2 to 3 seconds, within which events feel simultaneous, feel co-present, and this interval is necessary for perception to work. Because if the present were truly instantaneous, if it had no duration, then there could be no perception of motion, no perception of change, no perception of anything except static snapshots, with no connection between them. And so the brain creates a window, a moving window that slides along the timeline, integrating information from the immediate past with information from the present instant. And within this window, there is no sense of before and after. Everything feels like it is happening now. And only when events fall outside the window do they become past, become memory, rather than perception. And the edges of this window are not sharp, are not clearly defined. There is a gradient where the recent past fades into history and the immediate future emerges into anticipation. And this fuzziness is why temporal order judgments are difficult, why people often cannot tell which of two closely spaced events occurred first, why the subjective sequence of events can differ from the objective sequence. And experiments show that the brain does not perceive events in the order they occur, but reorders them, retrospectively constructs a sequence that makes sense, that fits with expectations, that creates a coherent narrative. And this reordering can be demonstrated by showing people visual and auditory stimuli in close succession and asking them to judge which came first. And the answers are inconsistent, vary depending on attention, on prior exposure, on the semantic relationship between the stimuli. And what this shows is that temporal order is not given but inferred, is a conclusion the brain arrives at rather than a fact it registers. And the brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, prefers a meaningful sequence to a faithful sequence. And this preference is not conscious, is not deliberate, is built into the perceptual mechanisms that construct experience. And so what is lived is not what happened, but what the brain decides happened. What fits the story? What makes sense in retrospect? And retrospect is the only perspective available, because by the time an event is experienced, it is already past, is already memory. The neural processing takes time. The signal has to travel from sense organs to cortex, has to be integrated, interpreted, bound into a unified percept. And all of this happens in the past, in the few hundred milliseconds before the event enters awareness. And so consciousness is always behind, always lagging, always commenting on what has already occurred. And the sense of being present, of experiencing now, is an illusion created by the brain backdating its own representations, stamping them with a time signature that says this is happening now, when really it happened a moment ago. And the moment ago is imperceptible, is hidden by the smoothness of the construction, by the fact that the lag is constant and so feels like zero, feels like immediacy, when really there is a gap, a delay, a space between occurrence and awareness that is filled by processing, by the mechanisms that turn raw sensation into coherent experience. And within this gap, anything can happen. Any reordering, any editing, any adjustment that makes the story work. And there is no way to catch the brain in the act. No way to compare the experience to the reality, because the experience is the only access to reality, is the only data available. And so the illusion is perfect, is undetectable from within, can only be inferred from indirect evidence, from experiments that catch the brain making mistakes, from situations where the constructed sequence contradicts the known sequence, and these situations are rare, require careful setup, because most of the time the construction is accurate enough, is close enough to the actual order of events, that no discrepancy is noticed, no problem arises, and this is what the mechanisms are optimized for. Not perfect accuracy, but sufficient accuracy, good enough to navigate the world, to avoid predators, to catch prey, to coordinate action with perception. And beyond that threshold, there is no selective pressure, no reason for the system to be more precise, and so it is not. And the sloppiness is revealed only in edge cases, only when looked for, only when the philosopher or the neuroscientist designs experiments to probe the boundaries of temporal perception and discovers that the boundaries are not where common sense suggests they should be. Memory is not storage but transformation, not preservation but reconstruction, and every act of remembering changes what is remembered, alters the trace, modifies the engram, and this modification is not corruption, is not failure, is the way memory is supposed to work, because the function of memory is not to record the past but to inform the future, to extract patterns from experience that will be useful later, to generalize, to abstract, to create rules and heuristics that apply across situations. And this requires flexibility, requires that memories be updated when new information arrives, when context changes, when the significance of an event is reinterpreted in light of subsequent experience. And so memory is always current, is always reflecting the present state of understanding. And this is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable, why people can be completely confident in memories that are completely false, why families argue about what happened because each member remembers it differently, and each is certain their version is correct, and all of them are wrong. All of them are remembering not the event, but the last time they remembered the event, and each remembering leaves a new trace, slightly different from the previous trace, and over time the memory drifts, diverges from what actually happened, and there is no original to compare it to, no master copy that remains unchanged. The first encoding is itself an interpretation, is already shaped by attention, by expectation, by emotion, by all the factors that determine what gets noticed and what gets ignored. And so from the beginning, memory is selective, is partial, is biased, and every subsequent recall adds another layer of bias, another round of reconstruction. And what remains after years is often more fiction than fact, is a story that has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on a life of its own, has become part of identity, part of the narrative of who I am and where I came from. And this narrative is precious, is defended against contradiction, is maintained even in the face of evidence, because it is not just information, is not just data, is meaning, is the framework through which life makes sense, and threatening the memory is threatening the self, is suggesting that the person is not who they think they are, that the past they rely on is unreliable, and most people cannot tolerate this suggestion, reject it, become angry, double down on their version, and this rigidity is not stubbornness, but self-protection, is the mind defending its coherence, maintaining its integrity against fragmenting forces, and the alternative, accepting that memory is unreliable, that the past is uncertain, that identity is built on sand, is too destabilizing for most, is a kind of epistemological vertigo that threatens to dissolve the ground beneath everything. And so, the illusion is maintained, the confidence is preserved, the memory is trusted even though it should not be, and life continues on this foundation of useful fictions, of pragmatic falsehoods, of stories that are not true but are necessary. And perhaps truth is not the right criterion. Perhaps what matters is not whether the memory corresponds to what happened, but whether it serves the present, whether it helps navigate current challenges, whether it contributes to functioning. And by that standard, most memories are good enough, are functional, even if they are not accurate, even if they are inventions, even if the past they depict never existed except in the retrospective construction that claims to be reporting it. And this is the deepest illusion of time, not that it flows or that the present is specious or that duration is constructed, but that there is a past at all, that history is something that happened rather than something that is happening now, in the present, in the act of remembering, in the process of telling the story. And the past that is remembered is not behind, is not earlier, is right here, is present, is part of the current configuration of neural states. And saying it is past is just a way of talking about certain kinds of present states, the ones that claim to refer to earlier configurations. But the earlier configurations are gone, do not exist, cannot be accessed, and what remains is only the claim, only the reference, only the trace that says, this is a memory, this is about then, but the saying is happening now, is present. And so the past collapses into the present, is revealed to be a mode of present experience rather than a separate domain. And if the past is present, then the future is too, is also a mode of current experience. The anticipation, the planning, the fear and hope and expectation that constitute futurity, and these are present states as well, are neural activity happening now, that interprets itself as being about later, but the later never comes, never is experienced, because when it arrives it is now, is present, and the present is all there ever is the only time that exists, and the flow of time from past through present to future is a story told within the eternal now, is a way of organizing experience, of making sense of change, of creating narrative continuity across discontinuous moments. But the moments are not discontinuous, are not separate, because separation requires time. And time is what is being constructed, is the product, not the container, is what emerges from the activity of brains, not what brains exist within. And this inversion, this recognition that time is inside rather than outside, that temporality is a feature of consciousness rather than a feature of the universe, changes everything, makes the question not what time is but how time is made, not when things happen, but how happening is experienced, not whether the past is real, but what reality means when applied to something that exists only as a present claim about a vanished state. And these questions have no final answers, have only perspectives, only frameworks, only ways of talking that are more or less useful depending on context, depending on purpose. And the illusion of linear time is useful, is necessary for planning, for learning, for maintaining the fiction of personal identity that makes social life possible. But it is still illusion, is still construction, is still something the brain does rather than something the brain discovers. And knowing this does not make the illusion disappear, does not make time stop feeling like it flows, because the feeling is built in, is automatic, is not subject to voluntary control, but the knowing changes the relationship to the feeling, creates distance, creates perspective, makes it possible to see the machinery at work, to recognize that what feels like the fundamental structure of reality is actually the fundamental structure of experience. And experience is not reality, but a model of reality, a map, not the territory, a useful approximation that is wrong in systematic ways. And the wrongness matters when the goal is understanding rather than functioning, when the question is what time is rather than how to use it. And these questions have occupied philosophers for millennia, have generated countless theories, countless arguments, and none have settled the matter because the matter is not empirical, is not something that can be resolved by more data or better experiments, is conceptual, is about what categories to use, what framework to adopt, what language game to play, and different games give different answers. And there is no metagame from which to judge which game is correct. Only pragmatic considerations, only questions about which framework is most useful, for which purposes, and for most purposes the folk framework is sufficient. The common sense view that time flows and the past is real, and memory is retrieval, and only when that framework breaks down, only when the contradictions become too obvious or the questions become too fundamental, is there reason to look for alternatives? To consider that maybe time does not flow, maybe the past is not real, maybe memory is not retrieval. And these maybes are not conclusions but invitations, not statements of fact but suggestions to look again, to question the obvious, to doubt the immediate, to recognize that the illusion of linear time is so convincing precisely because it is illusion, because it's made to be convincing, because that is its function, and seeing through it does not require rejecting it, does not require abandoning temporal language or pretending that past and future do not exist, only requires holding them lightly, provisionally, as useful fictions rather than ultimate truths, as tools rather than discoveries, as constructions rather than constraints. And in that lightness there is freedom. Not freedom from time, but freedom within it. Freedom to recognize that the experience is made, is chosen in some sense, even if not consciously. And what is made can be remade. What is chosen can be chosen differently. And the architecture of temporal experience, while deeply ingrained, while largely automatic, is not completely fixed, can be altered through practice, through attention, through deliberate cultivation of different modes of awareness. And these alterations do not reveal the true nature of time, but reveal that there is no true nature, no fact of the matter, only different ways of experiencing, different ways of constructing, different ways of being temporal creatures in a universe that may not be temporal at all, that may be timeless, eternal, a block, where all moments exist at once and the flow is purely in the eye of the beholder, in the structure of consciousness that moves through the block, not because the block is moving, but because consciousness is change, is process, is the activity of comparing states and calling that comparison time. And if this is right, then time is mind-dependent, is subjective in a radical sense, is not something that would exist without observers to construct it. And the universe before consciousness, before brains, was not a universe in time, but a universe of timeless physical states, of mathematical relationships, of geometry without duration. And only when matter organized itself into patterns that could represent their own history, that could compare past states with present states, did time emerge. Did temporality become a feature of the world? Not of the physical world, but of the phenomenal world. The world is experienced, and this emergence is recent, is evolutionary. Recent is less than 1 billion years old in a universe that is 14 billion years old. And for most of the universe's history, there was no time, no flow, no past or future, just configurations of matter energy, obeying laws that contain no temporal asymmetry, no preferred direction. And even now, time exists only locally, only in the small pockets of the universe, where consciousness has emerged, where nervous systems have evolved the capacity to construct temporal narratives. And the rest of the universe remains timeless, remains a four-dimensional block. And what is called the flow of time is the motion of awareness through that block. And the motion is not in the block, but in the awareness. Is a property of minds, not of space-time. And this might be the final truth about time, that it is ours, that we made it, that the illusion of linear time is not an illusion of time, but the creation of time, the bringing into being of something that would not otherwise exist. And in that creation, there is something profound, something that makes consciousness significant, not because it reveals the world, but because it transforms the world, adds temporality to what was timeless, adds meaning to what was bare fact, adds story to what was merely structure. And whether this addition is valuable, whether time is something worth creating, is a question each moment must answer for itself, right here in this specious present that claims to be flowing but is really just being, just the fact of awareness watching itself and calling that watching time. Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper in 1963 that destroyed 2,000 years of philosophy, not by offering a new theory, not by constructing an elaborate argument, not by marshalling evidence or appealing to grand principles, but simply by describing 2 cases, 2 simple scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. And these cases were so straightforward, so devastating, so impossible to dismiss, that they shattered the definition of knowledge that had stood since Plato, the definition that said knowledge was justified true belief. And in the decades since philosophers have tried to repair the damage, have proposed dozens of modifications and additions and qualifications, have added 4th conditions and 5th conditions, have distinguished types of justification and types of truth and types of belief, and none of it has worked. None of it has produced a definition that captures all and only cases of knowledge, that avoids counterexamples, that does what definitions are supposed to do. And the question is whether this failure reveals something about knowledge itself, whether knowledge resists definition, not because philosophers have not been clever enough, but because definition is the wrong tool, because knowledge is not the kind of thing that can be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, because the project of analysing knowledge was misconceived from the start. The cases themselves are almost too simple. In one, a person looks at a clock that has stopped but happens to look at the moment when the stop time matches the actual time. They form a justified true belief about what time it is. The belief is true. The justification seems perfectly adequate. They looked at a clock and clocks are generally reliable. But this is not knowledge. It is luck. It is coincidence. It is the kind of situation where we want to say the person got it right but did not know. And in the other case, a person believes their colleague owns a Ford because they have seen them driving a Ford for years. They infer from this that someone in the office owns a Ford. And it turns out someone in the office does own a Ford, but it is not the colleague. It is someone else entirely. And again, there is justified true belief, but no knowledge. The justification was good. The belief was true. But the connection between justification and truth went through the wrong path, depended on a falsehood succeeded by accident rather than by the proper relation between evidence and reality. These cases reveal something philosophers had not noticed before, that justification and truth can come apart in subtle ways, that a belief can be justified and true without the justification being what makes it true, without the truth being because of the justification. And this gap, this disconnect, this possibility of luck intervening between justification and truth is what makes justified true belief insufficient for knowledge. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes obvious that knowledge requires not just justification and truth, but the right connection between them. Requires that the truth be non-accidental, be because of rather than merely accompanied by the justification. And this seems like it should be easy to fix, should be easy to add to the definition. Just require that the belief be justified and true, and not Gettiered, not undermined by luck, not true by accident, and problem solved. But this is where the real trouble begins. Because no one can say what it means for a belief to be non-accidentally true. No one can define luck in a way that is not circular, not question-begging, not itself dependent on an intuitive grasp of what knowledge is. The natural move is to say that knowledge requires a reliable connection between belief and truth, that the method that produced the belief must be one that generally produces true beliefs. And this is reliabilism, the view that knowledge is reliably produced true belief. And this avoids Gettier cases because in Gettier cases, the belief is not reliably produced, the stopped clock is not a reliable method. The inference from the colleague's Ford to someone owning a Ford goes through an unreliable intermediate step. And so reliabilism can say these are not knowledge because they fail the reliability condition. But reliabilism faces its own problems. It faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify the relevant type of belief. Forming process, because any process can be described at many levels of generality. Looking at a clock is a reliable process, but looking at this particular stopped clock is not. And which description is the right one? Which is the type that matters for knowledge? And there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer this, no principle that determines the correct level of generality. And without such a principle, reliabilism cannot be applied, cannot deliver verdicts about particular cases, cannot do the work a theory of knowledge is supposed to do. Goldman tried to solve this with proper function, with the idea that the relevant process is the one that evolution, or learning, or some other natural process designed the cognitive system to perform. And this gives a non-arbitrary way to pick out process types, but it introduces new problems. Problems about what counts as proper function, about whether knowledge requires biological or social or individual design, about whether malfunction always destroys knowledge or only sometimes. And these questions proved as difficult as the original Gettier problem, generated their own literature, their own debates, their own unresolved puzzles. Others tried causal theories, theories that said knowledge requires a causal connection between the fact and the belief, that you can only know that P.I. if P causes your belief that P, and this handles some Gettier cases. The stopped clock case involves no causal connection between the actual time and the belief about the time. But causal theories face problems with knowledge of abstract objects, with mathematical knowledge, with knowledge of the future, with any case where the thing known does not seem capable of causing beliefs, and the theory had to be abandoned or modified into something so hedged with qualifications that it lost its initial appeal, its initial promise of solving Gettier with a simple, elegant condition. Nozick proposed tracking, the idea that knowledge requires that the belief track the truth, that if P were false, the person would not believe P, and if P were true in nearby circumstances, the person would believe P, and this captures something important, captures the idea that knowledge involves a kind of sensitivity to truth, a responsiveness that is missing in Gettier cases. But tracking faces problems too, problems with closure, the principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you can know Q by inference. Because tracking does not preserve closure. You can track one truth without tracking what it entails. And this means Nozick's theory implies you can know you have hands without knowing you are not a brain in a vat. And this seems wrong, seems like a bullet too large to bite. And most philosophers rejected tracking for this reason, even while acknowledging it captured something about knowledge that justified true belief missed. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a fourth condition, someone finds a counterexample, the condition is modified, new counterexamples appear, the modifications multiply, the theory becomes baroque, loses its explanatory power, and eventually is abandoned in favour of a new approach that promises to avoid the problems of its predecessors. And this new approach inevitably faces its own counterexamples, its own difficulties, its own descent into complexity and qualification. And after 60 years of this, the epistemological community is no closer to a widely accepted definition of knowledge than it was when Gettier published his paper. And some have begun to suspect that this is not a temporary problem, not a sign that philosophers have not been clever enough, but a permanent feature of the concept of knowledge itself, a sign that knowledge resists analysis, that it cannot be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, that the classical project of defining knowledge is not incomplete, but impossible. Williamson argued exactly this. He claimed that knowledge is primitive, that it cannot be analysed into more basic components, that it is a mental state in its own right, rather than a compound of belief and justification and truth. And this means the Gettier problem is not a problem to be solved, but a symptom of trying to do something that cannot be done, like trying to define yellow in terms of non-colour concepts, like trying to analyse consciousness into purely physical terms. And if Williamson is right, then all the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis, all the fourth conditions and modifications and qualifications were doomed from the start. We're trying to define the undefinable, to analyse the primitive, and the right response is not to keep trying but to give up, to accept that knowledge is basic, that epistemology can still study its properties and relations without being able to define it, that not everything can be reduced to simpler components. But this seems like defeat, seems like giving up on philosophy's traditional task, and many resist it, continue to search for a definition, continue to propose new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding the connection between belief and truth that knowledge requires. And this persistence is partly admirable, partly stubborn refusal to accept limits, and partly a failure to recognise when a project has failed, when the evidence is overwhelming that the goal is unreachable, that the concept being analysed is not structured the way analysis assumes, and the question is which interpretation is correct, whether continued work on the analysis of knowledge is noble persistence or futile stubbornness, whether the next theory might finally succeed or whether success is impossible. The externalism-internalism debate intersects with all of this, because Gettier cases reveal a tension between what the believer has access to and what makes belief knowledge. The person with justified true belief in a Gettier case cannot tell from the inside that they lack knowledge, cannot distinguish their situation from genuine knowledge by introspection or reflection. And this suggests that knowledge depends on external factors, on how the belief was actually formed, on whether the process was reliable, on whether the connection to truth was proper, and these are not things the believer necessarily has access to, not things that show up in consciousness, not things that can be known by reflection alone. And this means externalism is true. Knowledge is partly constituted by factors external to the mind, by relations to the environment that the knower may not be aware of. And this is deeply counterintuitive, deeply at odds with the Cartesian picture, where knowledge is transparent to the knower, where what one knows is fully accessible to reflection, where the mental is self-intimating and clear. But Gettier forces this conclusion, forces the recognition that knowledge can depend on facts. The knower does not, and perhaps cannot know, that there can be twins who are internally identical but differ in knowledge because they differ in environment. And this seems to violate something important about the nature of mind, about the privacy of the mental, about the authority each person has over their own beliefs. Yet the alternative seems worse, seems to deny that knowledge requires any external connection to reality at all, seems to make knowledge purely a matter of internal coherence or justification, and this would allow the brain in a vat to have knowledge, would make knowledge independent of truth, would sever the connection between mind and world that knowledge seems essentially to involve. The lottery paradox connects to Gettier through the problem of knowledge of conjunction. You know that ticket 1 will not win. You know that ticket 2 will not win. You know this for each ticket individually, because the probability of any ticket winning is negligible, but you cannot know that some ticket will win. Even though you know this must be true, and this seems wrong, seems like knowledge should be closed under conjunction, should allow you to put together things you know into knowledge of their conjunction. But if it does, then you can know both that no particular ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these cannot both be known because they contradict. And this reveals something about the nature of knowledge, that it is not simply high probability, not simply justified belief that is very likely to be true, but something more demanding, something that excludes a certain kind of luck or chance. And this connects to Gettier because Gettier cases are cases where justified true belief holds, but knowledge fails because of luck, because of accident, because the truth was not guaranteed by the justification. And the lottery case suggests that knowledge requires guarantee, requires that the truth not be accidental. But what counts as guarantee? What excludes accident? These questions have no clear answer, no consensus, no definition that everyone accepts. Contextualism tries to solve some of these problems by saying that whether someone knows depends on context, on what alternatives are relevant, on how demanding the standards are in the conversational situation, and in ordinary contexts, knowledge is easy to have, requires only that obvious alternatives be ruled out. But in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are raised, where brain-in-vat possibilities are mentioned, the standards rise and knowledge becomes harder or impossible to have. And this explains why knowledge seems to come and go, why we are happy to say we know things in ordinary life, but hesitate when doing philosophy. But contextualism faces problems too. Problems about whether the standards really vary or whether we are just more careful in philosophical contexts, problems about how context determines standards, problems about disagreement between people in different contexts who seem to be making incompatible claims. And like every other approach to knowledge after Gettier, contextualism captures something, but fails to capture everything, solves some problems, but creates others, and the dialectic continues, endlessly, inconclusively. Zagzebski showed that any analysis of knowledge that adds conditions to justified true belief to avoid Gettier will face its own Gettier-style counterexamples, that there is a recipe for generating such cases, and this is a kind of meta-Gettier problem, a problem not just with the original definition, but with the entire project of modifying it. And her argument suggests that the problem is not with particular proposals, but with the form of analysis itself, with the attempt to understand knowledge as justified true belief plus something. And if she's right, then the only options are to abandon analysis entirely, as Williamson suggests, or to abandon the justified true belief framework altogether, to start from scratch with a completely different approach. And some have tried this, have proposed that knowledge is a kind of ability, that it is acquaintance with facts, that it is constituted by the safety or sensitivity of belief, that it is a matter of having conclusive reasons, and each of these departs from the traditional framework. Each tries to rethink knowledge from the ground up, but each also faces objections. Each struggles to handle the full range of cases. Each eventually generates its own literature of problems and refinements and counterexamples. The phenomenon of epistemic luck is at the heart of all this. Gettier cases are cases of epistemic luck, cases where true belief is not the result of epistemic virtue or proper cognitive functioning, but of fortunate coincidence, and knowledge excludes epistemic luck. This much seems clear, but epistemic luck comes in many forms. Veritic luck, where the truth is accidental. Evidential luck, where the evidence is accidentally good. Content luck, where the belief happens to be about something true by coincidence. And maybe knowledge is incompatible with some forms of luck, but not others. Maybe some amount of luck is inevitable in any finite cognitive system operating in an uncertain world. And the question is where to draw the line. Which kinds of luck destroy knowledge and which do not? And there seems to be no principled way to answer this. No theory that gets all the cases right. No definition that excludes exactly the right amount of luck without excluding too much or too little. Sosa's virtue epistemology tries to handle this by saying that knowledge is true, belief that is accurate because adroit, because of the exercise of cognitive ability, and Gettier cases fail because they are accurate, but not because adroit. The belief is true, but not because of skill, and this seems promising, seems to capture what goes wrong in Gettier cases, but it faces questions about what counts as ability, about whether being in a good environment is part of ability or a separate factor, about whether knowledge requires that ability be exercised in the right way, or just that it be exercised. And these questions prove difficult, generate their own debates, and the theory fragments into animal knowledge and reflective knowledge, and different grades of knowledge. And what started as a simple, elegant idea becomes complex and qualified and contested. The situationist challenge from social psychology raises doubts about whether cognitive abilities even exist, whether there are stable traits that manifest across situations, or whether behavior, including cognitive behavior, is mostly determined by situation rather than character. And if situationism is right, then virtue epistemology is based on a false assumption, based on the idea that people have stable cognitive abilities when really they have only situational responses. And this would not just undermine one theory of knowledge, but would call into question the entire picture of knowledge as something stable, something dispositional, something that inheres in persons rather than emerging from person-situation interactions. And while most epistemologists have not taken situationism seriously, have not fully grappled with its implications, it represents a potential crisis, a challenge from outside philosophy that could overturn assumptions epistemology has relied on for centuries. The Gettier problem has become emblematic of philosophy's condition, of its inability to solve problems definitively, to reach consensus, to make progress in the way sciences do, and critics point to 60 years of post-Gettier epistemology as evidence that philosophy is confused, that it asks questions that have no answers, that it pursues definitions that cannot be given, and defenders respond. That philosophy is hard, that concepts like knowledge are genuinely complex, that the lack of consensus is not failure, but the nature of inquiry into fundamental questions. But the defense sounds hollow after decades of effort that have produced no solution, no widely. Belief does not wait for evidence, does not require justification, does not emerge from careful reasoning, but appears fully formed, arrives with conviction intact, and only afterward does the mind scramble to find reasons, to construct arguments, to build the scaffolding of rationality around a conclusion that was never reached through rationality in the first place. And this sequence is backward from what is taught, from what people believe about their own thinking, from the narrative that says humans are rational creatures who form beliefs by weighing evidence and following logic to wherever it leads. But the narrative is false, is a story the conscious mind tells about processes. It does not control and barely witnesses, because the formation of belief happens beneath awareness, happens in systems that operate according to principles that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with survival, with coalition, with identity, with the deep need to belong to a group and signal loyalty to that group through the adoption of its beliefs. And the adoption is not chosen, is not deliberate, is automatic, is the result of exposure and repetition and emotional resonance. And once a belief is formed, it becomes self-protecting, becomes resistant to challenge, becomes the lens through which all subsequent information is filtered. And the filter is not neutral, does not simply organize data, but actively distorts it, amplifies what confirms, and minimizes what contradicts. And this distortion is not dishonesty, but cognition, is the normal operation of a mind that is not designed to find truth, but to maintain coherence, to protect existing beliefs from disintegration, to avoid the cognitive and social costs of changing one's mind. And the costs are high, are often higher than the costs of being wrong, because being wrong in private is invisible, but changing one's mind in public is betrayal, is defection, is the signal that one is unreliable, is not committed, is willing to abandon the group. And groups punish this, punish uncertainty, punish the appearance of wavering, reward certainty even when the certainty is unjustified, especially when it is unjustified. Because justified certainty requires evidence, and evidence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is threatening to group cohesion, but unjustified certainty, certainty that comes from faith, from commitment, from identity, is the strongest signal of loyalty, is the proof that one believes not because the evidence compels, but because the group demands, and this demand is the engine of belief, is what makes convictions stick, what makes them resistant to argument, what makes smart people believe wrong things, not despite their intelligence, but because of it. Because intelligence is a tool, and tools can be used for any purpose, including the purpose of defending beliefs that were never formed through intelligence in the first place. And the defense is sophisticated, is elaborate, is often more complex than the defenses offered by less intelligent believers, because the intelligent mind has more resources, more information, more ability to construct rationalizations that sound convincing, that appear logical, that give the impression of having been arrived at through careful thought when really they are working backward from a conclusion that was never in question. And the conclusion was never in question because it was not a conclusion but a premise, was not the end of reasoning but the beginning, was the starting point that determined which evidence would be noticed, which arguments would be persuasive, which authorities would be trusted. And trust is not distributed evenly across all sources, but is allocated according to alignment, according to whether the source supports the belief or challenges it. And sources that support are credible, are reliable, are worth listening to, while sources that challenge are biased, are corrupt, are motivated by hidden agendas. And this asymmetry is not recognized by the believer, is not seen as bias but as discernment, as the ability to distinguish good information from bad. And the distinguishing is easy because good information is information that confirms, and bad information is information that contradicts. And this is motivated reasoning, is the process by which the mind arrives at the conclusions it wants to arrive at while maintaining the illusion of objectivity, the sense that the conclusion was forced by evidence rather than selected in advance, and the illusion is convincing, is believed by the person doing the reasoning, is not cynical manipulation, but sincere self-deception, is the mind fooling itself, because being fooled is useful, is adaptive, is what allows people to hold beliefs with confidence, even when the beliefs are unsupported, and confidence is what matters socially, is what others respond to, is what makes a belief persuasive, not because it's true but because it's held strongly, and strength of conviction is mistaken for strength of evidence, is treated as signal that the believer knows something, has access to information, has done the thinking, when really the strength comes from identity, from the fact that the belief is tied to who the person is, to what group they belong to what side they are on. And sides are not chosen through reasoning, are chosen through affiliation, through accidents of birth and circumstance, through exposure to certain narratives at formative moments. And once the side is chosen, the beliefs come with it, come as package, come as the price of membership. And the price is paid gladly, because membership is worth more than truth, is worth more than accuracy, is the thing that makes life meaningful, that provides identity, that offers protection. And protection requires conformity, requires that everyone in the group believes the same things, or at least claims to believe them, and the claiming becomes believing through repetition, through public commitment, through the performance of belief that eventually converts into genuine conviction. And the conversion happens without awareness, happens gradually, happens through the mechanism that psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction, where the mind alters beliefs to match behavior because behavior is harder to change, is more visible, is more socially consequential, and so the internal adjusts to match the external, and what was performed becomes believed, and what was believed becomes identity. And identity is the deepest level, is the level at which challenge feels like attack, like assault on the self, and the self defends, mobilizes resources, recruits intelligence in service of protection, and intelligence is effective, is dangerous in this role, because it can construct arguments that are superficially compelling, that exploit real ambiguities in evidence, that find the weak points in opposing positions. And these arguments are not offered in search of truth, but in defense of identity. Our weapons, not tools, are designed to win, not to discover, and winning means making the other side look wrong, look foolish, look motivated by bias, and the accusation of bias is always available, is always applicable, because everyone is biased, everyone is motivated, everyone is reasoning from premises they did not choose, and cannot justify except by appeal to other premises they also did not choose. And so the accusations are symmetrical, are hurled back and forth, without resolution, without movement, without any possibility of convergence, because convergence would require both sides to treat truth as the goal, to be willing to change their minds if evidence demanded it. But evidence never demands anything. Evidence is passive, is interpreted, is filtered through the beliefs that are already in place. And the beliefs that are already in place are determined by identity, by group membership, by tribal affiliation, and tribes do not care about truth except insofar as truth claims serve tribal interests, serve to distinguish us from them, serve to mark boundaries, to maintain cohesion, to provide narratives that explain why we are good and they are bad, why our beliefs are justified and theirs are delusions. And the asymmetry is total, is never recognized as asymmetry, but always experienced as accurate perception, as seeing clearly while others are blind, and the blindness is attributed to stupidity or dishonesty or indoctrination, never to the same mechanisms that are operating in oneself, because one's own beliefs are transparent, are not seen as beliefs but as obvious facts, as the way things are, and the way things are is not up for debate, is not subject to revision, is the foundation on which everything else is built, and challenging the foundation threatens the structure, threatens everything. And so the challenge is rejected, is deflected, is met with hostility or mockery, or the dismissal that treats the challenger as not worth engaging, as beneath consideration, as so obviously wrong that responding would be a waste of time. And the waste is avoided, the belief is preserved, the identity is protected, and life continues with certainty intact, with the conviction that one is right, has always been right, will always be right, because being right is not a state that can be verified, but is a state that is claimed, is performed, is the stance that the group requires and the individual provides. And the providing is not sacrifice, but fulfillment, is not loss but gain, is the way that belonging is achieved, is the way that meaning is found, is the way that the chaos of existence is organized into a coherent narrative where the self is on the right side, is part of the good, is aligned with truth, even if truth is never actually encountered, never actually sought, never actually valued except as a rhetorical weapon to use against opponents. And opponents are necessary, are required by the logic of tribal epistemology, are the ones whose wrongness confirms our rightness, whose existence justifies our beliefs, whose errors prove our accuracy, and the errors are easy to find, because looking for errors is what confirmation bias does, is the selective attention that notices everything that supports the belief and overlooks everything that contradicts it. And the overlooking is not deliberate, is not conscious suppression, but automatic filtering. Is the mind attending to what it expects, what it is primed to see? And the priming comes from belief, comes from the framework that determines what is salient, what is relevant, what is worth noticing, and what is worth noticing is always what confirms, is always what can be incorporated into the narrative, and the narrative is not discovered but constructed, is built from selected pieces of evidence that are arranged to tell a story, and the story is always the same story, is always the one where we are right and they are wrong, where our beliefs are based on evidence and theirs are based on bias, where we are rational and they are emotional, where we are honest seekers of truth and they are motivated by power or fear, or some other corrupt motive, and the motives that are attributed to others are never attributed to the self, are never seen as operating in one's own reasoning, because one's own reasoning is transparent, is experienced as simply responding to facts, as following evidence, as arriving at conclusions that are forced rather than chosen, and the forcing is illusion is the feeling that arises when motivated reasoning is operating smoothly. When the mind has successfully convinced itself that the conclusion it wanted to reach is the conclusion that evidence demands, and the demand is retroactive, is constructed after the fact, is the rationalization that makes the belief feel justified, that allows it to be held with confidence, that enables the believer to defend it against challenge and feel virtuous in the defending. And virtue is the reward, is what makes belief feel good, feel right, feel like something more than preference. And the more than preference is what gives belief its power, its capacity to motivate action, to organize communities, to inspire sacrifice, because preference can be changed, can be updated, can be revealed as merely subjective. But belief that is felt as knowledge, as truth, as correspondence to reality, is not subject to change, is not vulnerable to challenge, is the rock on which identity is built. And the rock is not geology but psychology, is not objective but constructed, is not discovered in the world but imposed on the world. And the imposition is what makes the world intelligible, what makes experience coherent, what prevents the vertigo of radical uncertainty. And uncertainty is intolerable, is the state that humans will do almost anything to avoid, will believe almost anything to escape. And the escape is into certainty, into conviction, into the feeling of knowing. And the feeling is what matters, is what provides comfort, is what makes belief functional regardless of whether it is true. And truth is a secondary concern, is something that is appealed to but not pursued, is a value that is claimed but not practiced, because practicing it would require epistemic humility, would require admitting that one could be wrong, that one's beliefs could be mistaken, that the group could be misguided. And these admissions are costly, are signals of weakness, are invitations for opponents to attack. An attack is what happens when certainty is dropped, when doubt is expressed, when the fortress of belief shows cracks and the cracks are not tolerated, are repaired immediately, are filled with rationalizations and justifications, and appeals to authority. And authority is not expertise but alignment, is not knowledge but membership, is the voice of the group speaking through individuals who have internalized its beliefs so thoroughly that they cannot distinguish their own thoughts from the thoughts they were given. And the giving is not noticed, is not experienced as indoctrination, but as education, as the transmission of knowledge, as the inheritance of wisdom. And wisdom is what every group claims to possess, is the special access to truth that justifies its existence, that explains why belonging matters, why loyalty is required, why defection is unforgivable. And the unforgivable is treated with expulsion, with shunning, with the withdrawal of recognition that makes social existence possible. And the possibility of this withdrawal is what keeps believers in line, keeps them performing the beliefs, even when doubt arises, even when evidence contradicts, even when the rational part of the mind recognizes that the belief is unsupported, because the rational part is weak, is outvoted by the social part, by the emotional part, by the parts that understand that survival depends on belonging, and belonging depends on belief. And so belief is maintained, is performed, is protected against challenge, not because it is true, but because it's necessary, is the price of membership, is the cost of identity, and the cost is paid continuously, is paid in the suppression of doubt, in the dismissal of contrary evidence, in the construction of elaborate rationalizations that allow the belief to persist despite its failures, despite its contradictions, despite the mounting evidence that it is wrong, and wrong is what every belief eventually becomes, is the fate of all convictions that are held rigidly, that refuse to update, that treat themselves as final, as complete, as not subject to revision, because the world changes, because evidence accumulates, because what was plausible becomes implausible, and the implausible becomes undeniable, and the undeniable is denied anyway, is rejected through the mechanisms of motivated reasoning that are so powerful, so sophisticated, so effective at maintaining belief in the face of counter-evidence that they can preserve convictions long after those convictions have ceased to correspond to anything in reality. And the lack of correspondence does not matter, does not affect the strength of belief, does not reduce confidence, because belief is not about correspondence, is not about mapping the world accurately, is about maintaining identity, maintaining belonging, maintaining the narratives that make the group cohere. And coherence is more important than accuracy, is more valuable than truth, is what holds communities together, what makes collective action possible, what allows humans to coordinate at scale. And scale requires shared belief, requires that everyone is operating from the same assumptions, the same frameworks, the same narratives, and the sharing is not achieved through evidence, but through repetition, through ritual, through the constant reinforcement of the beliefs that define the group. And the reinforcement is everywhere, is in the stories that are told, the heroes that are celebrated, the enemies that are vilified, the history that is remembered, and the history that is forgotten, and the remembering and forgetting are selective, are curated to support the narrative, to make the group look good, to make its beliefs seem justified, seem necessary, seem like the only reasonable position. And reasonableness is performance, is the appearance of having arrived at belief through rational process, when really the process is post hoc, is the construction of justification for conclusions that were reached through identity, through emotion, through the non-rational processes that govern most of human belief. And the most is almost all, is the vast majority of what people believe, is believed not because evidence compels, but because believing is required, is expected, is the condition of membership in the groups that provide meaning and purpose and protection. And without these groups, the individual is lost, is isolated, is without framework, without narrative, without the stories that make sense of suffering, that explain why things happen, that provide hope that the future will be better, or at least that the struggle is meaningful. And meaning is what belief provides, is the primary function, is more important than accuracy, more valuable than truth. Because humans can tolerate being wrong, but cannot tolerate meaninglessness, cannot survive without the sense that life is going somewhere, that actions matter, that the side they are on is the right side, and the right side is always the side they are on, is always the group they belong to, is determined by belonging rather than determining it. And this circularity is invisible, is not recognized as circularity, but experienced as logical necessity, as the way things obviously are. And the obvious is what is most suspect, is what most needs examination, is where belief is most rigid, most defended, most immune to challenge, because the obvious is the foundation, is the premise that cannot be questioned without everything else collapsing, and collapse is unacceptable, is the threat that keeps belief in place, that makes certainty feel like safety and doubt feel like danger, and so certainty wins, always. Wins not because it is right, but because it is functional, is what the mind needs to operate, to make decisions, to navigate the world. And navigation does not require truth, only requires consistency, requires beliefs that are stable enough to be acted upon. And stability is what identity provides, is what tribal epistemology achieves, is the freezing of belief into doctrine, into dogma, into the unquestionable truths that define the group and exclude the other. And exclusion is the point, is the function, is what makes identity possible. Because identity is not what you are, but what you're not, is defined by boundaries, by the line that separates us from them, believers from heretics, the enlightened from the deluded. And the delusion is always on the other side, is always what they suffer from, never what afflicts us, because we see clearly, we have truth, we are right, and the rightness is not a conclusion but a premise, is not the end of inquiry, but the foreclosing of inquiry, is the state that belief aims for and maintains through every mechanism available, through confirmation bias, through motivated reasoning, through tribal epistemology, through the subordination of truth to identity. And the subordination is complete, is total, is the condition of believing anything at all. Because belief without evidence is not the exception. But the rule is not a failure of reasoning, but the normal operation of minds that are not designed for truth, but for survival, for belonging, for the construction of narratives that make life bearable. And bearable is all that is required, is all that can be expected, is the standard that belief meets regardless of whether it meets any other standard, and other standards are luxuries, are the concerns of those who have the security to question, to doubt, to examine their beliefs, without fearing the social consequences. But most do not have this security. Most cannot afford doubt, cannot risk uncertainty, cannot survive without the conviction that they are right, that their beliefs are justified, that the group they belong to has access to truth, and the access is never demonstrated, never verified, never subjected to test, is only asserted, only performed, only maintained through the constant repetition of the beliefs that constitute the group. And the constitution is circular, is self-referential, is the tautology that defines all tribal epistemology. That we are right because we believe what we believe, and we believe what we believe because we are right. And the circle is unbreakable from within, can only be seen from outside. From the perspective of someone who does not share the belief, who has not internalized the identity, who can see the mechanisms operating, and the seeing changes. Nothing convinces no one, because the believer is not operating from evidence and cannot be swayed by evidence, is operating from identity and can only be swayed by changes in identity, by shifts in belonging, by the rare and difficult transformation that allows a person to leave one group and join another, to abandon one set of beliefs and adopt another. And the adoption is not reasoned, but is the same non-rational process operating in a different direction, is the formation of new convictions without evidence, is the replacement of one certainty with another certainty. And the certainty is what matters, is what the mind needs, is what belief provides, regardless of content, regardless of truth, regardless of anything except the function of making the world intelligible, making the self coherent, making belonging possible. And possibility is all that belief promises, is all that it delivers, is the opening of a space where life can be lived with conviction, with purpose, with the sense that one knows what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, what side to be on and what side to oppose, and the opposition is necessary, is required by the structure of belief, is what makes belief matter, what gives it weight, what makes it worth defending, worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when every rational consideration suggests it should be abandoned, because abandoning belief is abandoning identity, is abandoning belonging, is abandoning meaning, and meaning is what makes existence tolerable, is what makes life worth living. And this worth is not measured in truth, but in function, not in correspondence, but in coherence, not in accuracy, but in the capacity to organize experience into narratives that can be shared, that can be believed, that can be held, with the conviction that comes not from evidence but from faith. And faith is not the opposite of reason, but its foundation is the ground on which all reasoning occurs, is the set of premises that cannot themselves be justified but must be assumed, must be taken on faith, must be believed without evidence, because evidence requires premises, and premises require faith, and the faith is inescapable, is built into the structure of belief, is what makes belief possible, is what makes the mechanics of belief mechanical, automatic, operating below awareness, producing convictions that arrive fully formed and are only later dressed in the clothing of reason, given the appearance of having been derived from evidence when really they were derived from identity, from belonging, from the deep and desperate human need to be part of something larger, to believe something strongly, to know with certainty, even if the knowing is illusion, and the certainty is performance, and the belief is wrong.